Welcome to our 26th Satori, 26 years here in Harrisburg. This is our most sacred service of the year of our liturgical cycle. And we celebrate the story of Shakyamuni's enlightenment, but it really is about the enlightenment of all beings. So tonight I want to offer you something special. And I don't know if some of you saw the social media posting. It was Buddha, the Untold story. Now, you're back. I'm so glad. Sorry, guys. I was so enraptured in the liturgy, I didn't. So I want to start off this talk by saying two things that I think are really important to understand about this tradition. We are not really a people of the book. Now, what does that mean? It means that even though we have, at least according to the most recent calculations based on the libraries that are in Korea, 48,000 scriptures. So that's a lot. And yet, we're not considered people of the book. So what does that mean? It means that it's more about a living experience and sharing and adapting the teachings as they come down through the ages. We revere those scriptures. We refer to them. We reference them. But we do not hold them as having some authority over us that our experience challenges. And secondly, I would say we're not really a cult of personality. Or that great song by, what was that band back in the day? Living Color. That's it. We're not that either. We're because even though Shakyamuni Buddha is the guy that we kind of line up some of our liturgies from, and he's certainly our reference point, and we might even consider him the pioneer of our tradition, we don't really have the same relationship with him that Christians might have with Christ, for example. We don't see him as something that we can never be. Rather, we see him as what we will be. So, as the Buddha was once as we are, and we shall be as the Buddha is. So it's a little different in that sense. So I'm going to start off with a reading, as I always do, from some sacred writings. Now we know just what the journey's for. Looking out to the stars, think about what you are. Now those sacred words come to us from a kick-ass 80s metal group called Zebra. Does anybody remember Zebra? That's really going back. My son and I loved, you guys ever watch the Karate Kid series and the Cobra Kai series on Netflix? No, if you haven't seen it, it's really great. A lot of Dharma everywhere. Well, it made me think of it, the one character, Johnny, had a shirt with zebra on it. I thought, I haven't heard them in a while. You can find wisdom anywhere. So, there's this story that is supposed to be true, although it could be apocryphal, that when Einstein was teaching at Princeton, a student came to him and said, Professor Einstein, this test, these questions, these are the same ones we had last year. Is that right? And Einstein said, yes, that's correct, but the answers are different this year. That's the attitude that we try to engender. The idea that knowledge and understanding is something that's continually growing. So, for example, I'm going to get cosmic now. For the longest time, we've had theories about how old the universe is. And we based that on some very good data, right? So we calculated, I love when they get down to really like the points and the digits. They calculated somehow that it might be 13.8 billion years old. And that was what we went with for the longest time. And then recently, some new stuff that we've learned from our new astronomical research now indicates it could be closer to double that. Let's look at the story of human evolution. For the longest time, all our stories were, we started with Lucy. Remember Lucy? And we everything, the humans evolved out of Africa, and then they made this journey, and they dislocated and fought with and overcame other, hominids that were out there, like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and things like that. That's what we thought for a long time. That was the model. Now we're not so sure. Now the oldest fossils that we have all start here. And now the idea is it went down this way. So I kind of call it the vacation model. You get to choose. Either it was really hot and you wanted to go where it was cooler, or it was really cold and you want to go where it was warmer. But the point is, it changed. It dramatically changes the way we see things. And even this idea that there was, those shirts, where you see the steady, that's probably not true at all. In fact, our most common ancestor, probably some of us went off and became hominids and eventually humans, and the others went off and became apes. So it's a very different way of seeing things. But that's the beauty of it, right? The idea is that knowledge is not in, we don't encase it in a way that we then have to defend it. Now, the truth is, all these new insights and understandings, oh, believe me, there's orthodoxy, and it's going to fight it tooth and nail. Even some of the most recent things that were found, like the skeleton remains of Grecopithecus, for example, and the footprints they've found that are 6 or 7 million years old, that even indicate a settlement of hominids. Some people don't even want to look at it because it just throws off the whole thing. All the textbooks have to be rewritten. Same thing with the age of the universe. But see, what I'm saying here is, we, at least in our tradition, and I think it's true for Buddhism, we engender this idea that nothing is fixed. And everything is constantly changing, including our understanding of nature and reality. So I say that as a kind of a lead-in. So when I start telling you these alternate stories of the Buddha and his origin, you'll keep that in mind. Because I'm not saying this is the absolute truth. But what I am saying is the newest scholarship, research, and archaeology seem to indicate this is probably more likely. Okay? Now, one of the things we do before we get to that story of Buddha, we have to talk about a people that probably, according to more recent scholarship, probably had more of an influence on human civilization than almost any other group. But ironically, going back to times of antiquity and Anno Domini, or the Common Era, these people were put down as barbarians. Herodotus, for example, who wrote some strange histories, but was a historian back then, he said barbarians. He praised their warrior-like ways and the fact that they had mastered the horse and the chariot and the wheel. He gave them that. But they were terrible, terrible people. And you will even find it in the Christian New Testament and one of the epistles of Paul, where he points out the Scythians like, ugh, can't trust these people. And what's fascinating is, I'm sure there was good and bad, but these people had much more of an influence probably on us and on our world today than any other group that we know of. And remember, these guys go back 9,000, 10,000 years now. These were the people of the steppe. These are the people who first domesticated the horse and the wheel, as I said, and the chariot. Oh, the list is huge. When you look at them, and some people would say the precursor to them were the Proto-Indo-Europeans. You've heard of them, I imagine, if you went to school or studied history at all. And so they're kind of a glossy people, and they have the Yamnayas, and they have these different groups. But the Scythians are the ones who emerge who seemed to be the height of what these people were. Now, we'll do Q yesterday. Now, so what are some of the things that they, can claim? And remember, they go from the Paleolithic into the Bronze and Iron Ages, a long period of time. And they went into, so let me get this right so I don't miss anything here. And I was going to talk about the Pleistocene, and do you guys all know we're still in an ice age? This is the interglacial period where it's warmed up a little bit. It's going to get really cold again, more than likely. It has before. So we're in an interglacial period. And of course, a lot of what we have in terms of record of human history come at that period, about 11,000 years ago. So a lot of our records, besides the archaeological ones, are pretty recent, so to speak, if you will. But they produced, language. Most language today, and some would say all, are rooted in that Proto-Indo-European language. All of them, everything. In fact, one of the things that I found fascinating was if you study that language, or you study the oldest roots of that we can find, man, it really opens the doors for understanding other languages because they're all rooted in it. Ceramics, clothing, pants. Anybody wearing pants? They were the first ones. Pyramid building before the Egyptians in Europe, Eurasia. Isn't that crazy? Agriculture, animal husbandry, as I mentioned before, the idea of the horse. They were martial arts warriors unparalleled. In fact, you never hear the story of the Amazon warrior women? Guess who they were? Scythians. The Scythians had women trained as warriors. And so again, something very fascinating, I find. And then the other part to them was you have the Siberian connection, right? Some of these Scythians are related to the Siberians, and even to, you could say, modern Russians too, and also Indian people. And the thing that's so wild about that is that this influence, they called it the Sun Lion Shamans. And this is this long lineage that goes through. And these were the descendants of Siberian shamans. And these visionary Arya sages, their main belief was in a spiritual force who would inflame the mind with the fire of awakening. Sound familiar? And I think last time I was here and I gave a talk, I said, the story about the hay, finding the needle in the hay. Most people didn't know that that's actually Buddha. And he said, how do you find it? And one of our very enlightened individuals said, you burn it. All that's left is the needle. Well, the roots of it are right there. Even their idea of the way you do royalty, the idea that somehow the leader of the community is divinely connected, comes from these people. And this led them to some very interesting areas: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, biology. Some would even say a form of psychology. And one in particular I found interesting was sky watching, a meditative form that was based on looking beyond the horizon. That'll come back. Just hold on to that one. And the idea of the consubstantiality of the soul and spirit, rebirth. The idea of the breath, ruach, prana, chi, ki, as the connection. Scythian. Now, we get down to what's called the classical age in history. And we find the first real philosophers. And again, Scythians, all. In fact, the first one I'm going to talk about is considered the greatest. The Greeks considered him the greatest sage of their world, of their time. You ever hear of him? Anacharsis. Isn't that crazy? Anacharsis. Now, Anacharsis was half Scythian, half Greek. But his teachings all of these guys I'm going to mention here were dealing with one particular issue, and that was the problem of the criterion. You ever hear of that? Any philosophy majors? The problem of the criterion? What is true and what is false? How do you determine what's true and what is false? And so for Anacharsis, it was the idea of skepticism. He is considered the father or the forerunner of all skeptic traditions that followed in Greece. And it was the idea that you would question knowledge. Now, some of it I really love. Like one of the statements is this. See if you dig this. Here's a line. There is no absolute truth. You see it? Now that's called they called it an antimony, right? And the other aspect was intelligy. And I love this one, and this is no offense to my wife because she's actually much better at this now. But for years, when we were going somewhere, it took her a while to get ready. And sometimes she would say this line to me, I'm almost quite ready. But you see, even within something like that, there are the opposites. So it was, how do we deal with these opposites? So Anacharsis' approach was at least to start with the idea of skepticism. Can we really know? Can we really know? And then, excuse me, the person that came after that is Zoroaster or Zarathustra, right? Is it Wagner, the great Wagner piece, 2001, Space Odyssey? Is that the one? Thus spake Zarathustra. Strauss. So Zoroaster or Zarathustra, he's the other figure that comes in. Again, they're all in the same time range. His answer to it is to say there is good and there is evil. There is a duality at the heart of the cosmos. And that becomes his way of dealing with the problem. And then we have our guy, Shakyamuni. And his approach becomes known as the middle way. That the truth of things is not found in their extremes. And even the truth in ourselves is not found in the extremes, but found with balance. And so his approach was balance, but it was also similar to Anacharsis in that there was nothing that could be ultimately proved. So the idea of absolute truth or absolute falsehood, you can't do it. So that's wild, right? That begins, according to even scholars who really argue with this new information, they admit the classical age begins with these guys. They set the foundation for what we really think of as philosophy. Cool so far? You digging it? You like it? Yeah. Now, some time ago, now we're going to get into Shakyamuni. Some time ago, I was going to write I put together an idea for a book, and I shopped it around. I went to a lot of academic publishers, and I couldn't get anybody to publish it. I called it Blue-Eyed Buddha. Now, the reason I did it is because of paintings that were found in China. These paintings go back way back. And there were similar ones found in Afghanistan. And they're very old. And what's fascinating is the Buddha has blue eyes. Now, these people in general did not. So this idea must have come from somewhere. Well, Scythians, by and large, were blue-eyed, blonde, redheads. Now, there were also dark and brown, but that's a small group being blue-eyed. It's not a popular thing. It's not a common thing. And yet that was registered. So some of the stuff I'm going to share with you, even though now there are many other scholars who have kind of come to the same place, I, back in 1998, had proposed this idea just because of my own research. So it's kind of fun when you're in that, kind of a scholar thing, you kind of like, wow, it's cool when everybody kind of thinks maybe the same thing. So let's talk about that. So we all know the traditional story of Shakyamuni, right? Raised in Nepal, northern India, raised under a father, Suddhodana, which is interesting, by the way. I call this talk or sermon the greatest gift, by the way. And his dad, Suddhodana, that name means giver of gift. Suddhodana, giver of gift. And so everybody kind of knows that story, right? He had never somehow seen a guy who was old, seen someone who was sick, etc., right? Kind of sounds weird, but that's the traditional story. And he goes out, and he has his experience. What this most recent scholarship seems to imply is that that's not true. That this was a teaching parable that was composed over the centuries to teach the main elements of the Dharma. And he was very much adapted as an Indian, even though his name, Shakyamuni, that he becomes known by, means the sage of the Scythians. It's right there. So what is a possible story? So this is the best stuff we have. And some of this stuff comes from recent records that were found in Persepolis, the ancient capital of the fourth Pakistan or Persian emperor, Darius the Great. Now here's what's wild. They have been identified and associated with these names: Siddhartha Gautama and Suddhodana Gautama. Now what's interesting about that is it places the Buddha not in India, but in Sakhistan. And Sakhistan was an ancient term for, I think it's like modern Iran and Pakistan. And so this is where he comes out of. Now what's interesting about this is that there's evidence for this in the traditional writings too, especially the Nikkei or Nikayas, where they refer to Taxila as being the place where he went to go to school. And Taxila, of course, you find over in this particular area. And we also know that the tradition says he was a Kshatriya, which was one of the four Arya or noble groups. They were the warrior clan, the horse clan, the ones who probably originated martial arts as well. And the martial arts come down into India, and the Payuta, which then eventually finds its way into China in the 5th century of the Common Era. But again, originates with these people. So after his youth in Sakhistan and a period of training, the belief is then he headed for Babylon. Now remember, Babylon was it, man. Babylon was the center of the known world. And there, he quickly rises to a place of high position in religious circles, even to becoming the chief priest of the pre-Darius interfaith Magi. Now, how we know this is because there's a character that's written about that fits his time perfectly. And this person, so let me just finish that line of thought. He may have rose to a high position in those circles and even chief priest of that group. And here's where we get this from. Inscriptions of Darius the Great, the Persian emperor, who was emperor for about 30 some years, he boasts that Zoroaster, remember him? His god, Ahura Mazda, has proclaimed that Darius is to be the divine king. And he has to take the throne from an usurper. And what's this usurper? Well, let's talk about him. Now, his reign would have been short-lived, less than a year, according to these records. But nonetheless, he was the head of the Magi, the head of the Babylonian order of interfaith Magi, and he, for a time, was the king of Babylon. Now, what's interesting about this, even though this was a very short period, here's some things that even Darius says about him. He was called Stargazer. Remember the old Scythian sky watchers? And then we have the story of the Buddha, right? What's he do? He looks above the horizon, he sees Venus, the morning star, and that's when he has his awakening. They called him the Stargazer. He was described as a compassionate philosopher, cosmologist. He decreed freedom for slaves, lowered oppressive taxes across the board, and inspired neighbors to respect each other in a city known for its diverse ethnic groups and many languages. This guy espouses liberty, human rights, and generosity. And he would have been familiar with all the known religious traditions of the time, including the Jewish ones. King Josiah would have been his contemporary. So guess what this guy's name is? Gautama. And Gautama is the inversion of Gautama. Now, do we know this for certain? No, but it's kind of weird. Now, what's interesting is Darius has a father, Buchia, who's out somewhere in northern Africa in some campaign, and he gets killed. And so when he finds out that Gautama has risen to become king of Babylon, he immediately heads back with Zoroaster. And the first thing he does, according to his records, is he has him assassinated. Now, if he did have him assassinated, what's fascinating is there's no record of this. There's no record of this in the writings of how this was done and when it was done. It was just said that it was done. And it's kind of cryptic. Now, what's interesting is, if this person is Shakyamuni, then he wasn't murdered at that time. And he would have escaped into Magadha. Because that's where then all the stories we're familiar with start. And if you look at the map, it makes perfect sense. And he would have hid in the forests of Magadha. Now, I think, and that's what this also is, others are sort of kind of getting from this, is that it was sometime during that period where he has his big awakening, the one that we celebrate tonight. And you see a change, and it would have absolutely, then I think he did go into India and so forth and teach. But that's why people always wonder, why is the Middle East the center of Buddhism? Oh, that's why. It began there. And the question is, why, this story, what goes on here? What are we talking about? Well, so we have this guy who starts this movement, right? Shakyamuni. And you see a change in the culture of the India of that time, of the place of the Ganges. And it goes from being Vedic to shamanic. And this doesn't happen before the date of the Buddha. So at some point there was a complete change. Now this alters everything, because these scholars are saying all this idea we have that, this traditional idea that Buddha was some kind of Hindu who reformed Hinduism is complete and utter nonsense. Or that Jainism was a contemporary. No, they place it at the feet of the Scythian sage. And then all these stories that are told later. And you have to remember something. These stories were told 4 centuries later. And in fact, the first story we have of the Buddha that actually is the one that we all know, if we know it, was a novel written by Ashvaghosha 400 years later. Let's talk more about this guy. So one of the things that's interesting, right? He starts this community. He starts teaching this thing called Buddhadharma, and starts teaching the middle way. He starts talking about how the main practice is what we call mindfulness, right? And we think of mindfulness as meditation, but that's not what he's thinking of. You read the Nikayas. Mindfulness is burning the fire. It's lighting the fire to the hay and leaving the needle. It's removing obstructions. It's clarifying things. It's getting rid of thoughts and beliefs that are unclear or absolute. And he founds this community, and they call it the Sangha. Now, all historians that study this period will tell you this is the first known democratic community. The only seniority there was by the amount of time you had studied. They developed, this group movement develops the first colleges called viharas. And these viharas were later adapted during the incursions of the Muslims, and they became madrasas, but they copied them exactly. Exactly. And in some ways, during that period of time, again, dealing with, that part of the world, they preserved this knowledge and this understanding, which later then went into the medieval and the scholarship period. One of the things I didn't mention was also the recursive method. Have you ever heard of that? That was another thing that came out of these Scythian people. And that's the beginning of the scientific question. It's called the recursive argument. And it leads to, in Europe, the scholastic method, where you have this sort of Hegelian idea, here's your thesis, now present the antithesis, and then go from there. Begin here. So here now it gets interesting. So the idea in this version is that people didn't like this guy because he was preaching the same thing that he was doing in Babylon. And there was an emerging form that was coming out of the Vedas, the Rig Vedas, which was the idea of the caste system. And he was challenging that and did not allow that to exist in the Sangha. And so people really weren't happy with this guy. Now, some of the scholars in this line believe that Darius never did give up getting rid of him. But we do know he was gotten rid of. So it's kind of interesting when you look at it. So he's challenging not just those things, he's challenging Zoroastrianism. He's challenging the duality of Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism becomes absorbed in India as Brahmanism. And so it's later said that he's challenging the Brahmins. And he probably did that too. But it probably began with the Zoroastrians. So here's what's interesting. We have a very different vision here. And you actually get this from looking at some of the Nikayas. They were always trying to get rid of this guy. He had a main student named Devadatta, which some actually believe was related actually in reality to Darius. And this guy was always trying to get rid of him. He tried to frame him. He killed a prostitute and put her bloody body outside of his dwelling, and then went to the king and said Shakyamuni had killed her. He tried to have him murdered by dropping a boulder on him at one point, having a mad elephant try to crush him. And unfortunately, eventually, they have some success. Shariputra, you know that name? Shariputra is considered to be the Buddha's greatest disciple along with Ananda. And there was another called Moggallana, who we do Oban around, Moggallana's mom. Not long before the Buddha, according to this, was murdered, they were murdered. And it's right there in the text. Somehow it's glanced over. And they try to nice it up a little bit in some of the versions. Well, he just happened to get sick. But when you come to Shakyamuni, it's almost as if he knows this is going to happen. And that's why in the story in the Nikaya, he tells everybody, don't eat this. And they didn't know whether it was barbecue pig or it was some kind of mushroom, but guess what it really was? When you actually analyze the language, it was a poison made from mushrooms that pigs ate. And as soon as it's like he knew it. It was like he knew he was by Kunda. He knew he was being portrayed, and he knew that he was going to die. And that's why he told them, don't let anybody eat this and bury it so the animals don't eat it too. But what's fascinating here is it creates a very different idea or story of how this man's life began and how it ended. And it's not quite so soft and gentle as the traditional versions that we're used to. So, Buddhism then established in Gandhara in Afghanistan. They adapted into the Greek world, the Ptolemaic dynasty. Do you guys know the Ptolemaic dynasty? Alexander the Great, when he went in, his number one guy was Ptolemy, who was number one guard or soldier or general. So he becomes the pharaoh of Egypt, and then his descendants also called the Ptolemaic pharaoh reign. And guess what? Guess what the main literature that's going back and forth from Ptolemy to the areas there in that part of the world, Gandhara? Buddhism. He was studying Buddhism. We actually have the documents, the records. So this is where it all starts to generate, and then it kind of grows out from there. Boy, I could go on and on, but I don't want to go too much longer. It's getting kind of long. The main thing that I'm trying to get out of this is, and if someone is interested, I'm happy to share the rest of it with you. It probably deserves a retreat day more than an evening. Is that this really is something. Really something historical. That this teaching, this idea, changed everything. I mean, these ideas are completely filled in what we go to, the Greek world. Completely. And from there, the influence is massive. You can look at people at the Renaissance, like Ficino and Erasmus, which then inspired Luther and the Reformation and even the Revolution. If you look at the declarations of the French and the Americans, it's there. These ideas of individuality, of skepticism, of challenging these ideas of divine right, they're all right there. So what a gift we have. And so if nothing else, I hope in some way, in some small measure, it makes you really feel good or confident. Dang, this is good teaching. This is good stuff. And here's the other thing I found about it so inspiring. It didn't matter what the group was. It didn't matter if they were Middle Eastern. It didn't matter if they were Indian. It didn't matter if they were North African. It didn't matter. That there was the idea that we united people was not all these different backgrounds and these ideas, but it was these common teachings, this common concept. That's the thing that can liberate. And that's the part I really kind of dug. What time is it? Anybody know? Are you guys bored? All right, I got. This is for our Christian friends. This is the Christian holiday too, right? So I'll give you a little bonus track on this. All right, a little extra fun. Where is it? And if I don't find it, I'll just do it from memory. So here's some things. So like if you like the Judeo tradition, the Jewish tradition, right? What's fascinating is that if you ever study the Rig Veda, there's a character in there who is a shaman or yadu, and this guy's life kind of parallels what we know of Abraham. Now Abraham comes out of Babylon. They call it Ur, but it's Babylon. And he comes out of there at the collapse of the Sumer-Akkadian Empire. And he adapts a god, El, who was actually the bull god of that time of those people. And the bull is a very important figure because you're going to find the bull represents power and resilience and strength and all those sort of things. And often the figures of the prophets would have horns, bull horns, because it represented this sort of thing. And so what's fascinating is the story of his people ends up in Egypt and then back into Babylon at the time of Cyrus, as I mentioned, Josiah. And this is the time of Shakyamuni, by the way, Gautama. And much of the history of the Jews, too, during the Babylonian captivity is influenced by these same people. Now, how do we know this? Well, we know during the Babylonian captivity, a lot of things changed, even in how they viewed the idea of God. Even though they tell the same stories, it has a very different variation. like whenever the people were called as a census. One version before the captivity says that God did it, or it was done by just sort of a more general sense of God, and then after that it becomes more that it was the devil that did it. It was the adversary. So there's an idea of duality that comes in there. And of course, in Zoroastrianism, we have the whole story, right? We have the Messiah, we have the end of the world, we have the resurrection, we have the whole thing right there. And what's fascinating is, to me, too, one of the most interesting things is that to me, one of the most beautiful things about Judaism is the Sabbath. It's the idea of Sabbath, having that one day where you rest, you break out. What's interesting is this may have developed by Jews who were Scythian, and they're known as Ashkenazi. That means Scythian, by the way. Ashkenazi means Scythian. And they had this tradition, which is really fascinating, is that they had this thing called Sebutu. And it was a name for the seventh day, and then the seventh after it, and the seventh after that, and it was to the end of the month. And thus there were before Sabutus, and this became the Sabbath. Because even the word itself is related to it. And once you know Ashkenazi means Scythian, then it becomes much clearer. Well, the other thing too, and I'm going to finish with this too, is a sort of a bonus fun, like I said. Buddhist communities were established in North Africa and Egypt around the time of Ptolemy, and they were there before. Some of them say they were way there before that. Think of it this way: when Jesus was walking around, or think of St. Paul, there were Buddhist monasteries in the background that had been there for 300 or 400 years. That gives you a whole different impression, right? And so it's something this little thing of mine, I think that the stories of Jesus come from an amalgam of Buddhist, Hellenized, Jewish, and Roman Flavian influence. What's interesting too about the Nativity, it would have been the now post-Darian or Darius Zoroastrians, but that's the Magi that in the story that visit. And what's interesting is the Messiah may have come from this character in the early Buddhist writings called Maitreya. He was considered the next Buddha to come. And when you translate him out into Persian, it becomes Mitra and Mithra in Rome. And guess who is celebrated on December 25th? Well, Jesus, but before that, Mithra. So I thought that was kind of cool too. And my own belief is that this idea of this Gnostic, it influenced the Gnostic tradition. It emerges and influences the Christian tradition. I was convinced by a friend of mine who's an Orthodox abbot and scholar. He believes that Buddhism gave birth to Orthodox Christianity because of mantra, mala, and meditation. And that's his idea, which he shared with me 30 years ago. So it's just fun to see all that stuff. All right, here's the last one. Santa Claus. It's possible that Santa Claus was the influence of the Siberian shamanism again. And the way that we get into this is the Amanita muscarida. You familiar with it? It's a mushroom, right? Now you've all seen it, usually in kids' stories or Christmas stuff. You're going to see what colors? Red and dots of white. Now what's fascinating is that these mushrooms are known for, they're also called a fly agaric. They're known for their hallucinogenic properties, not just similar to like a DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And so what do you get? Well, here it is. You have these shamans wearing red and white like the mushroom. The mushrooms are found under the pine, particularly. They are cut and dried. It's the only way you can consume them is by drying them out to a certain degree. You do that by hanging them over a fire. Or you have to do it through a particular creature who consumes them. By the way, they love these things and consume them a lot. and that is reindeer. Reindeer love these, consume them, and then the shamans would strain the urine, and the urine is what would be drank. Yeah, it's like that coffee that it's the cat has to poop it out, and then they make the richest coffee in the world from it. well, here's one of the things. That particular mushroom makes one of the things, the phenomena from it, is it makes you think that you can fly. And the last thing I'll say about this, funny, and it's really hilarious, is that these people had yurts, more like yurts. So there was like the center thing that would have been like a chimney, you will. Well, guess how they got in during this ceremony? Yeah! Isn't that crazy? Now, no one can absolutely say, yes, this is where it all came from, but boy, the coincidences start sort of piling up on it. So I thought you might enjoy it. It could be. So anyhow, I'm going to stop. I'm going to go. You will find it though on kids' coloring books, this mushroom, and in storybooks. So that's it, guys. I hope you found that interesting. Buddha, the Untold Story.
Question. I mean, it seems like so much of Christianity,
Excuse me.
Judaism, borrowed from Buddhism, and now you're starting to mention about Santa Claus and things. And when I came in, I saw a lot. What to me looks like a Yule log, and
it is.
Weekend is Yule, and I was wondering, did Buddhism as well as I know Christianity borrowed a lot from paganism as far as the Mary and a lot of those things. Did Buddhism borrow from paganism, and how is that?
Well, these Buddhists did. we borrowed the Yule log from Yule. I think that's one of the unique things. If you study any group that has adopted Buddhism in some way, Buddhism never went in and said, get rid of the culture. It would go in and bring it into itself. Other traditions have done that too, but Buddhism in particular does that. And so for me, that was one of the things that I did as part of our tradition here. Yep. Now I notice our Yule log, our candle is getting low there, so we have a backup one, right? Okay, good. Well, listen, let's go through with the service because it's a beautiful thing. And do we have the candles? We need the candles. Can you help distribute those? I guess I could answer another question or two while we're distributing the candles. Anybody have a question? Did that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. One of the things you'll find is that, like, when Buddhism went into Tibet, before the Dharma came in there, the Tibetans were known as the blue-faced monkey people. They were known as a warrior people who practiced cannibalism. Right? And then supposedly, the story goes, Padmasambhava, who comes from Afghanistan, comes in and he converts the king, and they all become Buddhists. And then from this point on, the things like cannibalism and stuff like that are done away with. But instead of just saying even something is like that, oh no, we can't do anything like that anymore. Instead of doing that, they would create these out of some dough they would create, and they would create this figure, and then the figure would become the embodiment of the ego in the different klishas, and then they would cut that ego up and eat that as a way of consuming it. Yeah. So that was the way they translated some of those Tibetan traditions, And as far as pagan goes, that word pagus means country folk. So most of the time, the pagans were the ones who weren't practicing what the main city empires were doing. And that's the only thing that's different. And in most of the cases, the main city groups were practicing some form of country stuff that had been elevated to the mainstream. But you'd find the roots back and forth. Scythian is Scythian. Scythian. Now, like I say, you got to do some deep dives because this new research, look up new stuff. Because the old stuff, they started at the 9th century, but it's just not so. So we've got our main candle lit. So what we're going to do now is we're going to chant the Ninbutsu to Silent Night. There's another.